A reading from the book of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 32 and 35 through 43. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to the bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you. Good morning. So good to be with you all. Yes, I've been really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful to be here. I've been grateful for your pastor, for David and for Ann and the friendship. It's also exciting that I've gotten to be part of like the conversations where this was just like an idea, a possibility, and now to get to see it's kind of coming into full fruition is such a testament to God's grace, and so I'm really grateful to be here. For me, it's a bit of a celebration at what the Lord is doing through the life of our network, our Redeemer churches, but also just a celebration of all the work that goes into something like this. So I'm very grateful to be worshiping with you today. Let me jump in. Let me start by just making what might seem obvious, but it's a big claim. It might seem obvious, but I think it's worth stating. If we cannot trust that God will do what he says he's going to do, then he is not worthy of our lives. If God makes promises and doesn't fulfill those promises, he is a liar, and we are all wasting our time gathering on a Sunday morning. Now, I think for many of us, we wouldn't want to say that explicitly. We wouldn't want to call God a liar. And yet, we feel this tension at various points in our lives where the promises of God seem like they're never going to actually come to fruition. We know about these promises, and yet they still seem so far away. You know, the joy that's promised often seems overshadowed by the anxieties of life. The healing that's promised seems consumed by the sickness and the death that's constantly around us. The justice that we're promised seems unachievable amidst the constant corruption of our day. The rest that was promised seems meaningless amidst the constant longings we possess every day. Now, just right up front, I want to just state what I'm hoping that we can wrestle with. Is that in the midst of those tensions, where it seems like there's promises that have been given and yet don't seem to be fulfilled, there's actually great hope in the midst of the inevitable waiting that we're going to find ourselves in, between when we hear a promise and seeing that promise ultimately fulfilled. And if God is God, if God is worthy of our lives, if God is good, he will not prove himself to be a liar, but prove himself to be a God who fulfills his promises. And here in Mark 5, I want to consider that waiting and what that waiting means for us in the context of our own waiting. Because I do think that what we're going to see is in the midst of the waiting, there's actually great hope. And there's actually something that God is accomplishing in the midst of the waiting that we would not have experienced except for the fact that he made us wait. And so to consider that, let's just consider two things today. Let's first consider the agony of waiting. And then second, let's take a look at the gift in the waiting. All right, so first, the agony of waiting. So let's just get a sense of what's happening here in our passage. So right out of the gate, what we're seeing here is Jesus, he meets this man named Jairus. And we're told that Jairus is one of the synagogue leaders, which meant that he was a lay official who was responsible for the management of the synagogue. What that means is that he would have been a very respected leader in the community. He likely would have been very well off. He would have been a man of influence and a man of resources. Now, given that role that he had, he also would have had a pretty good working knowledge of what's happening in the life of his community, including this man Jesus. He would have known about Jesus. He would have heard about Jesus' teachings, and in this case, related to our story, he would have heard about this Jesus who is able to heal. Now, we know that Jairus, in our passage here, he's desperate because this man of great respect, right? The whole community would have respected him. We're told in verse 22 that he came to Jesus and he fell at Jesus' feet. This highly respectable man is now groveling before Jesus. He's obviously desperate. And verse 23 goes on to say that he pleaded earnestly with Jesus. He says, "My little daughter is dying. Please come, put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him. So what we're seeing here with Jairus is that his daughter is in a dire situation. And the only hope that he has left is that Jesus comes with him and performs this great healing that he knows Jesus is capable of doing. Now, as a father, I can only imagine the panic that Jairus has to be feeling in this moment. I have to imagine that Jairus, at this point, he has used every resource at his disposal to save his daughter. But clearly nothing has worked. And so now in desperation, he pleads with Jesus to hurry because his daughter is not going to make it much longer. Jesus, please intervene before it's too late. And so, of course, Jesus goes with him. Now, here's the problem. Jairus, obviously, in a desperate time crunch. Time is of the essence for him. Getting back to his daughter quickly is vital for him. But we're told that as they begin to go, a crowd of people come, and that they're pressing on Jesus, and they're slowing Jesus down. Now, if you were Jairus, can you imagine what you'd be feeling in the midst of this crowd? I mean, I have to imagine we'd feel angry, we'd feel frustrated that people are in his way. And then on top of that, you have to imagine the disciples who were there also with Jesus. I can imagine that they're just annoyed that Jairus, this highly respected religious leader, is being slowed down by what I have to assume are just normies, normal people getting in his way. Right? We have important business to get to. Get out of our way, people. Especially for Jairus. I have to imagine there must have been this agony in waiting and moving so slowly through the crowd. It must have been terrible. But that said, there's another character in the story. In the midst of this crowd that's slowing them down, we're told that Jesus, he's touched by a woman with the issue of blood. We're told in verse 25 that she had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had a condition that caused a very heavy and prolonged menstrual bleeding. And in this culture at this time, that would have made her perpetually, ceremonially unclean, which simply would have meant she would have been on the margins of society. So not only was this woman dealing with a physical ailment, she also was ostracized and pressed out from the center of community at the time, which is why she sneaks in the way that she does, which is why she is desperate in the way that she is. And so because of this desperation, she reaches out to Jesus, moves through the crowd, touches Jesus' cloak in faith, believing that if she could just touch Jesus, she would experience healing. And she does. She's healed as she touched Jesus. But this is what I want us to see. All right? All of this is, everything I've said thus far is driving us now to verse 30. Consider what takes place after she's healed. It says this: At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Here's what's striking for me as I read that. Again, remember, Jairus, he's in anguish, knowing that time is of the essence. But not only is there a crowd slowing Jesus down, but now there's this woman that Jesus now chooses to talk to. In other words, Jesus isn't being slowed down. Jesus is choosing to be slow. Jesus is not in a hurry to get to Jairus' daughter. I mean, even the disciples, you can hear it in their confusion in verse 30. When Jesus asked, "Who touched my clothes?" They're like, "What are you talking about? You see all the people pressed against you. Why would you ask, 'Who touched me?'" In other words, what are you talking about, Jesus? Why is this of any concern for you that someone's touched you? But Jesus decided to take his time. And he decided to stop, find this woman, and then have a conversation with her. Now, I don't want to be insensitive to her plight, but if we have to choose between hurrying up to save a dying little girl or to have a conversation with a woman who honestly could have waited a few minutes, I think it makes sense which of the two we would decide. Of course, we'd go to save the little girl. But Jesus doesn't have the same urgency. That seems logical to us. Now, ultimately, the real blow comes in verse 35. The real blow to Jairus. Because it says that while Jesus was still speaking, in other words, while Jesus continues to have this seemingly unnecessary conversation, we're told that while he was still talking to the woman, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Jesus, he didn't get there on time. He seemingly got distracted. He maybe didn't seem to care enough. He didn't seem to understand how urgent the situation was. And because of all of that, the thing that Jairus feared most came to pass. His daughter died. Jesus did not come through. Now, friends, I wonder how incredibly relevant that story might feel for some of us today. I wonder how relevant it feels, how much we may at times, maybe even right now in this moment, feel like Jairus must have felt. Jesus, I have heard all the stories about what you're capable of doing. I come every Sunday and I hear about all the great things about who you are and what you do and what you promise. I have come to you in faith, believing that you have power and that you have control, and I have given you every opportunity to intervene in various areas of my life, and yet it seems like you've just stood by and you've done nothing. And now my greatest fears have come true, or the thing I loved most has been taken from me, or that area of my life that you know would have brought me joy and satisfaction is missing. It's gone, and it doesn't seem like it's ever going to come. You know, for some of us, maybe you've been told, God is my provider, and yet every day you still struggle to make ends meet. Or maybe you've been told, you know, if I just honor God in my singleness, God will bless me in marriage. Or I was told God loves family and he loves the beauty of parenthood, and yet God has refused to give me the children I desire. I've heard that God is a great healer, and yet cancer is taking over. I've heard that he's king, and yet he so often seems to let selfish, wicked leaders pervade our society. I've heard that he's a liberator. I've come to him for liberation because I'm trapped in cycles of addiction or the exploitation of porn or whatever it might be that constantly keeps drawing me back. I'm still stuck. I've heard that he's just. And yet I constantly hear stories of abuse and predation of the most vulnerable. It's everywhere. We might hear the promises of God, and yet the experiences of the now seem like God just doesn't care about what I'm experiencing now. It seems like God isn't in a hurry to intervene in my life and accomplish the things that he promised he would accomplish. And I'll also say, if maybe at this point in your life, you haven't experienced the devastation or the disappointment that comes by not receiving what you think you ought to be receiving, I promise you, if it hasn't come yet, it will come one day, where the experience of Jairus becomes very palpable and real, where it seems like God just does not care. God can't be bothered with what's going on in my life. And maybe, for some, our response to that is similar to the response of those that are in the house with Jairus. It's a version of it. Because for them, those that were in the house of Jairus, after they've seen this little girl die, they say to Jairus, why bother with the teacher anymore? And maybe for some of us, because the promises of God just don't seem to come, that's our initial reaction. I've given so much hope and faith in Jesus accomplishing what he said he was going to accomplish, and yet he hasn't come through, and so why bother with Jesus anymore? Right? There's obviously immense disappointment in Jairus' life. Of course, there's going to be immense disappointment in ours when we experience similar situations. And that disappointment can be enough for some to assume that Jesus is just not who he said he was. Or if he is, that God is just not the kind of God that God claims to be. You know, either God is not able to intervene in my suffering or my sorrow or meet my needs and desires. And if he's not, then he's not able. If he's not able to do it, then he must not be this all-powerful God that I always hear about. Or if he is this all-powerful God who's able to intervene in my suffering, meet my needs and desires, but doesn't, well, then he must not be good. So on either end of the spectrum, why bother? But coming back to the story, after hearing the news, after hearing about the girl that has just died, knowing all the emotions and the disappointment that must have been present, especially for Jairus, what does Jesus say? Verse 36. It says, overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, do not be afraid, just believe. That response for me means Jesus is not taken aback by the news. Clearly, Jesus is aware of what his delay has caused and what everybody must be thinking at the time. And clearly, in this response, we see that Jesus cares about what Jairus is feeling. But also, obviously, Jesus had a different purpose, a different plan than what Jairus thought was necessary. It's clear Jesus wanted Jairus to wait, but why? That brings us finally, to the gift in the waiting. So again, just returning to the context of the story, clearly, again, Jairus, the disciples, they know that Jesus can heal. This would not have been the first time Jesus was asked to heal. They've seen him do it at this point over and over again. At this point, they have categories for Jesus as a healer. And so the expectation is that Jesus will remain in the box that they've constructed for him, meaning Jesus is a teacher, so they expect him to teach. They know that Jesus is a healer, so they expect Jesus to heal. And if Jesus cured this little girl of this deadly fever, I have no doubt that there would have been great joy and great gratitude for Jesus' healing. But in the midst of that joy and gratitude, there'd also be a confirmation for them that Jesus is containable, he's understandable, and he's predictable. I came to Jesus for healing. Jesus healed me. Easy. This is what I expect from him. I expect Jesus to meet the needs that I present. This whole situation actually is a very similar one to a story that's recorded in the book of John. In John 11, if you recall, Jesus, he'd heard that Lazarus, his good friend, was sick and was dying. But we're told, if you remember, when Jesus hears about the news, we're told that Jesus waits for 2 days before going to see Lazarus. And in that time, Lazarus dies. And when Jesus finally arrives to see Lazarus, his sister Mary is at the tomb and says to Jesus, she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." I mean, this is the same problem that Jairus had. Jesus, you were too slow. Right? She too had Jesus in a box. Right? She too thought she could understand and predict Jesus. But while Jairus, Mary, the disciples, everyone else for that matter, they knew Jesus to be a teacher. They knew him to be a healer. What they had no category for was Jesus as a resurrector. And so after Mary laments to Jesus, his response is a very famous statement in verse 25 of that chapter. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life." In other words, I hold the keys of life and death, and I have waited. I have taken my time because I am capable of taking the greatest tragedy. And what area of life where we feel like we have the least amount of control? What is more tragic than death? Jesus proves that even amidst that great tragedy of death, he has complete control. And he has the ability to bring life where there is death. Now, that's a different kind of power, right? That's a different kind of power than what anyone had expected to see from him. But it's a kind of power that can only be seen. The power of resurrection life can only be seen on the other side of death. There's a level of control and sovereignty and might that can only be experienced through the beauty that comes from ashes, life on the other side of death. And that is what we see Jesus bring when he shows up to Jairus' home. Jesus, when he enters the home of Jairus, is about to upend everyone's paradigms and reveal something about himself that no one had ever seen. Verse 38, that when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. Now, just really quickly, some have actually tried to say that, well, see, Jesus says that she's sleeping, she's not actually dead, he just resuscitated her. This isn't actually a story of a little girl that died. And we're going to get to in a moment why Mark tells the story the way that he does. But the other accounts of the same story in Matthew and in Luke, it's very clear that she's absolutely dead. To everyone, including Jesus, it was clear that she was dead. And so when Jesus says that she's sleeping, everyone laughs because they know that she's dead. Again, they have no categories for what Jesus is about to do. His statement to them is just comical. But as we see, his power to raise the dead is akin to waking someone from sleep. That's how much power he holds. But then it continues in verse 41. It says, he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at this, they were completely astonished. In other words, what we're seeing here is Jesus upending their categories. And he did so only because he refused to adhere to everyone's expectations. He refused to move on everyone else's timelines. Friends, there is something about trusting Jesus in tragedy and disappointment that reveals to us something about God's love and compassion and mercy and presence that cannot be known and cannot be understood without the experiences of disappointment and grief and sorrow. I've been a Christian for a long time. I've been a pastor for a long time. And over the years, I can confidently say that this is true. That those who have the deepest faith are those who have experienced great tragedy, great loss, great disappointment, and yet have nonetheless trusted that God is good through it. And those with the most immature faith are those that demand that God meet their needs on their timelines and in the ways that they have predetermined are good, right, and true. There is something about a knowledge of God that comes only through trusting God in the midst of tragedy, recognizing that God is actually accomplishing something through even the most challenging of circumstances. Several years ago, maybe you saw this, Anderson Cooper, famously from CNN, was interviewing Stephen Colbert. And they were connecting over the effects of having lost their fathers very young. They both lost their fathers at very young ages, and then as a result of that, they had to become this stabilizing force even at the age of 10 for their mothers. Of course, these events completely changed the trajectory of their lives, and they were reflecting on that. And there's this really tender moment that you can find on YouTube if you want to check it out later if you haven't seen it. But this very tender moment when Anderson tears up over something that Stephen said. Now, if you know Stephen Colbert, he's a deeply committed Catholic Christian, and he's reflecting on his faith. Colbert said this about his dad dying young, and this is what Anderson was reflecting on. Stephen said this about his dad. He said, "I love the thing that I wish had not happened. I love the thing I wish had not happened." And Anderson, who was struck by the statement and a little bit confused by it, said, "Do you really believe that?" And Stephen, actually drawing on Tolkien, this is his response. It's a little bit of an extended quote, but let me read it, the full thing to you. This is what Stephen responds to Anderson. He says, "Yes, it is a gift to exist, and with existence comes suffering. I don't want it to have happened, but if you are grateful for your life, and I am not always, you need to be grateful for all of it. And what do you get from loss? You get an awareness of other people's loss, which allows you to connect with that other person, which allows you to love more deeply. If it is true that other people suffer, and it makes you grateful that you suffered so that you can know that about other people. I want to be the most human I can be, and that includes acknowledging and ultimately being grateful even for the things I wish did not happen because, this is the key, because they gave me a gift." I mean, do you hear what Colbert is saying? There is something. There's a gift that we only can experience when we let go of what we think we know, what we think we ought to have, what we think we deserve, and realize that every season of life gifts us something we might not otherwise have possessed. And the only thing that I would add to what Stephen says is important, is that this gift really only comes in its fullness when we allow it to point us in the right direction, which is toward Jesus. I don't want to seem fatalistic or glib, but there really is a different level of trust in God that develops when we believe that there is more that God can accomplish than we can possibly fathom, including through our suffering, including through our disappointment and our sorrows. If we have limited categories for how God works, We will never get the opportunity to experience an expanded vision of what God can do in all seasons of our lives, including those seasons of disappointment and hardship. And sometimes, again, it's only through those experiences of the thing that we dreaded most where we're able to then see God's goodness most clearly. Sometimes we need our preconceived notions, our predetermined categories about who God is. We need them upended. But there's one final thing I want us to see. And that is this, because what I just said could feel, I think, like a cold comfort. God's going to do something through your sorrow, period, sure. But there's something else that Jesus does here that I think presses this further. Look again at verse 41. He says, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. What's going on there? Well, Talitha cum, that's an Aramaic word. Now, Aramaic would have been the common language amongst the people at the time. And he says these words in Aramaic, Jesus says them in Aramaic, because it would have been a very familiar and personable language for them. What Mark is doing here, in the way that he's telling the story, is that he's drawing out the tenderness of the moment that Jesus is having right now. Talitha, it's a term of endearment, and it's actually related to the same word that means lamb. You know, in using that word coupled with taking the girl's hand, Jesus, he's showing this compassion and this gentleness. He's saying, my little lamb, it's time to get up. I mean, Talitha cum is the way that a parent would speak to a sleeping child. My dear, my little lamb, it's time to get up. This is a reminder that even in the midst of tragedy, Jesus is near, and he is near with compassion and gentleness. I mean, with Lazarus, going back to that story, even though Jesus knew that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, you remember what he does when he shows up to the tomb? He weeps with those who are weeping. Even though Jesus knows what's going to happen, he's still very present with those that are sorrowful and suffering. In the worst seasons of life, we have a Savior who meets us with compassion. And in this case, with a gentle word of compassion, he resurrects this little girl. Now, here's what's funny about that resurrection. In the story of Lazarus and in the story of this little girl, of all the different characters in the story, the only people who are not upset by the death are the two people who are dead. And the reason why I say that is because this little girl, Lazarus, I have to assume they were settling in to an eternity of blissful rest. At that point, they were uninterested in returning back to this world full of sickness and injustice and death. But, the other thing I would say about that too, they are one of only a few people in the history of humanity that had the great pleasure of dying twice. They are the only ones not upset about any of this. And it's also the case, if they died again, then what was the point of their resurrection? If Jesus is going to raise them to life only to then see them die again, what was the point of any of it? Why does Jesus raise them both? It's because these are opportunities for us to witness the kind of power that Jesus possesses to make all things right. It's a glimpse of what Jesus can do. It's a foreshadowing of how the good shepherd who comes and says to his sheep, my little lamb, get up, will one day be the shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. It's a small little glimpse of the extraordinary power that Jesus possesses, that he reveals to us on the other side of his death. I mean, Jesus eventually lays down his life so that sin and sickness and death might ultimately be defeated. On the cross, he takes upon himself all of our wounds, all of our sickness. But it would be through the power of his resurrection where we see the ultimate tragedy of death is not the end, but that in a cosmic way, through the resurrection, we can have a confidence to know that we will ultimately hear Jesus say, "Get up, my little lamb, arise." Resurrection life is only possible through death. But Jesus Christ has conquered death, and because he's conquered death, we can trust he has purposes for all of our tragedies. If he can have purposes through death, the greatest of tragedies, how much more could he have purposes for all the tragedies and sorrows we might experience along the way? And again, that might feel like a cold comfort, or that it's just some kind of wishful thinking, but it's not. It's the hope of the Christian life. It's the balm of the gospel to say that God is not distant from our pain. God is not indifferent. God is not slow. God is not what everyone must have assumed Jesus to have been on his way to Jairus. God is a God who is always in control, knows exactly the end from the beginning, and he is always at work, even when we don't understand what he might be doing. He nonetheless is near, present, Emmanuel, God with us through it all. I'll close with this. Colbert, after reflecting on the gift that had come through his suffering, this is what he says. He says to Anderson, he says, in my tradition, in the Christian tradition, that's the great gift of the sacrifice of Christ, that God does it too, that you're not really alone. God does it too. The beauty of the gospel is that Jesus Christ, our Savior, has stepped into our suffering, experienced the crushing sting of death. But of course, the great gift is also that he rose again. And that resurrection power is ours. I don't know all the reasons why God does what he does, why he allows what he allows, nor why he intends for us to go through seasons of grief and sorrow. I don't know all of it. I cannot answer what he is doing. But I do have a confidence to know it's not pointless, and that there's an opportunity for us to see him in profound new ways if we trust him even through it all, because he holds the keys of life and death. And as a result of that, as we trust in him, we will one day hear him say to us, "My little lamb, it's time to get up." Let's pray.